Well, I was just wondering on the topic of Central Asia, what do you think about what's going on in Afghanistan at the moment? I think I saw a report yesterday or the day before that the Taliban they're obviously starting to take back more cities and more of the country in general. I saw they took back quite a major city. They've also taken back a border crossing point with Tajikistan as well, I think, at some point. So what are your thoughts on that briefly before we dive into the bigger topics?
Of course. So Afghanistan everyone is watching at the moment because it is getting really scary. I mean, the momentum's been with the Taliban for quite a while now. And I think one thing that really demonstrates this to me is I spoke with an arms dealer who used to run guns into that area of the world. And the biggest thing that hit me was he said, we don't even sell them ammunition anymore because they're capturing so much from the United States, leaving areas. The Taliban are just taking more and more ground. And so far, they're taking most of the not contested territory. They're going after areas way out in the periphery or in the mountains or connecting towns. So a lot of your major cities haven't fallen yet. But I think they're smart enough to know that if they were to fire at US forces now at, let's say, Kabul, that the US would likely dig in and that would give them precedent to maybe stay a bit longer. Whereas if they wait until September, let the US leave, it then comes down to do they take Kabul or do they not take Kabul? There's a lot of people suggesting it may end up just a Kabul city-state that remains well funded by the United States, because when the Soviets left after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Kabul government, or the Soviet-aligned communist government in Kabul, actually held up for quite a while. You didn't fall until the money left. So effectively, they're hoping that maybe Kabul stands and they can have this president of Afghanistan who can represent Afghanistan at the United Nations or whatever, but the rest of the country will be effectively have fallen to the Taliban. The hope is that maybe the Taliban takes control, and they are already starting to contact US officials about really mundane things like how to do paychecks properly, how to run dams, how to do the really mundane, bureaucracy that comes with running a government. But they are, there's still this question of, do they take Kabul? Do they not take Kabul? And I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. And the terrible idea everyone's having at the moment is, right now, all of the warlords around Afghanistan are held together by this mutual, well, we got to get rid of the US kind of thing. What happens once that unifying factor leaves? Will these different parts of Afghanistan turn on each other and we just have sort of warlord areas, or will it become unified, or what happens there? And that's the question I think is on a lot of analysts' minds at the moment on what happens next in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and there was some more news on that recently this week. I think it was some bipartisan commission from the U.S. released, the state of what would happen, looking even like 6 months after the U.S. were to withdraw all of its troops, and they reached a fairly important milestone this week with regards to that drawout, that within 6 months that, Kabul could fall. And so do you have a sense from, the sources that you're aware of, as well as your own analysis, in terms of how likely that is? It would seem as if, the Taliban is trying to work on actually the nitty-gritty of building out government infrastructure, the taxes, the garbage, all of that specifics. It might not even be within their own strategic interests to go after Kabul right away, to maybe work on sort of solidifying rule within the majority of the country and then sort of, make that push at a later date. So do you have a sense in terms of what they're likely to do?
I think everyone's just watching the US's moves very closely at the moment. So we don't know, for instance, whether there is talk of maybe the US leaving 600 men behind. That's still on the cards. We don't know if, let's say, the US might just base a lot of planes and strike aircraft out of something like Uzbekistan or Pakistan, and effectively just any Taliban gets anywhere near Kabul, they'll just blow them out of the sky. And the Taliban know they're not dumb enough to go fight, take a city where there's A-10s strafing them every couple of minutes. I think it really depends. They're all just watching the US. If they see that Biden, let's say, tries to pay for some private military to go in or pay for a few troops to stay behind, there's real blowback domestically about that, and Biden has to take a step back and go, look, we're not involved in Afghanistan anymore, then they may know they have a free hand to do whatever they want. But my guess is they'll probably just leave Kabul to be Kabul and maybe take the rest. That at least gives them something to be unified, or gives something of these sort of 6 or 7 warlords who would probably be fighting for it, something to unify themselves against, rather than what will eventually happen is there'll be a power struggle. And that's what everyone fears, is when one side starts to lose, they turn to less than savory sources of money. hoping that they'll get enough funding to take out the other ones. And that's our biggest fear in Afghanistan.
And you were mentioning sort of looking to see what the U.S. does, right? Biden said that he wants to have all the troops out originally by September 11th, by the 20-year anniversary of 9/11. But as you also mentioned, that there have been reports saying that they're considering keeping 600 military advisors and forces within the region. You also have, already I think 6,000 or 7,000 private military contractors. The U.S., discussing providing air support for the Afghan military, as well as trying to pressure Turkey to support the major international airport as well. How much is the situation on the ground in Afghanistan with regards to sort of the power differentials on the two sides going to fundamentally change if the U.S. withdraws in this sort of 600 troops, still private military contractor presence, and all these sort of other arrangements that they're putting in place?
So there's a big fear in Washington at the moment that effectively when they pulled out of Iraq, all the Baathists who lost their jobs simply because they were part of the Baathist party, effectively were forming the sort of very early stages of ISIS. And there was a big fear, the Baghdad government was saying, look, we need you to come in and knock these guys out. The Iranians were saying the same thing, and the US went, no, we're not doing that. We're not getting involved in Iraq again. And that gave them enough time to germinate and build up. And rather than what could have probably been solved by a quick in and out, I know it's a Rick and Morty meme, but in and out, quick operation, don't worry about this, ended up being a very long operation because they didn't nip it in the bud when it was small. And I think everyone worries that maybe if they go, well, we're not going to do anything, and then we do see another terrorist state form in Afghanistan, if it gets time to germinate and gets time to get money in, then that's a much harder thing to fight later on. I can see the US definitely providing air support. I don't think the US population will, particularly be mad at drones being shot down. I think they'll be very mad if US personnel dies, but they won't be very mad at drones going down. But again, there's so much stuff in the air at the moment, whether Biden keeps people in or keeps private military in, that I think everyone just is trying to see where the dies are going to go, and I don't know if anyone knows where it is.
One thing on the drones question, sorry, and then I'll have all my questions on Afghanistan answered. But there was a recent report that U.S. airstrikes are at an all-time recent low under the Biden administration. Do you think part of that is sort of opening up drone capacity in the event that that's what they use to sort of support the Afghan military, in that they don't want to sort of expand the military budget? If they're sort of pulling out, that would be the last thing that they want to do. So if they cut back on military strikes elsewhere, then they have that funding and those resources to use in Afghanistan? Or is that that's not sort of how the military makes their decisions?
I think it's a multifaceted question. One of them is the fact that we look when drones really came into mainstream and all over the place and really became the front line of the US Air Force. It was during the Obama era where they were fighting multiple wars on lots of fronts, and you found they were bombing everything and anything with a pulse. But it ramped up dramatically under the Trump administration because they no longer kept tally on how many strikes they were making. They were given a free hand to do whatever they want. So obviously, rather than maybe using small mercenary groups or using, other methods to get rid of a group, under the Trump administration, it was much freer to just take out the whole wedding party. Who cares? Obviously, now that we've got an Biden administration, even if we're just snapping back to the Obama rules of what should be drone striked and what shouldn't, which again is quite high, but what that rule, that underlying is, we're just not involved in as many offensive operations at the moment as there was under the, when Obama was in power. We're not fighting massive thrusts in Afghanistan. ISIS is no longer there with a caliphate in Syria. Most of our drone strikes are pretty small, and they're in places like Niger and Mali and Somalia and all these sort of places. But it's effectively going back to the Obama standard of what counts for a drone strike, whilst there's no huge wars going on. Yes, this will free up capacity to use for other stuff, but again, a lot of the drones are just used for surveillance anyway. The amount of drones that actually launch strikes is a very small percentage compared to what's doing surveillance, and the surveillance drones are still very much in use around.
Looking towards the future of Afghanistan, you pointed out that the U.S. pulling out might lead to some civil strife within the country. it seems like one of the countries that maybe has the most stake in Afghanistan's stability moving forward is China. Do you see them sort of filling in where the U.S., is stepping out and sort of playing the role of the sort of administrator or supervisor to make sure things don't fall into chaos?
No, I don't see China wanting to get their hands dirty on this at all. So over the last few years, China has been building up, they don't call it bases, they call it border protection installations in Tajikistan. Making sure that there is no blowback from Afghanistan that folds into Tajikistan, then folds into Xinjiang. Because effectively they know that if terrorists leave, the borders on Tajikistan are fairly porous. They can get through quite easily. And then if they get into Kyrgyzstan, they can then make it into Xinjiang and cause problems for the Chinese government. So they're trying to curb the amount of sort of radicals that can get through into Tajikistan and calling it there. They really don't have the desire or the appetite to go do what the Americans did in Afghanistan because it will blow back on the Americans far harder than it blows back on China. And if they go in and start bombing villages and bombing attacks and doing what the Americans did in the early days, that's going to set off a lot of problems in the west of China. And they're already, that's already a pressure cooker there. So no, I don't see China getting any more involved than it has to. They may put some private military in, they may have some mining companies go in, they may do some negotiations, but effectively they've been building up forces on the Tajik border to make sure that this does not blow back into China.
Got it.
Do you think this? Sorry, go ahead, whoever that was, before I ask the question.
Oh, I was going to switch away from Afghanistan, so go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to sort of segment into that. I was just wondering. It seems a fairly obvious question in my mind, but do you think the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan was a political one or a strategic one?
I think there was a lot of politics with it. But again, there's no, every analyst has been saying this for yonks now, going, there's no solution, there's no victory to this war. And the longer we stay, it's just kind of kicking the can down the road. Eventually, the US was going to leave. And it's why there's a very famous saying in Afghanistan saying, you have the watches, but we have the time. Because they just knew the Americans are not going to stay there forever. So even if they hide in the background for 20 odd years, they know the Americans will eventually leave. That they are leaving. So whether it happened this administration or the next, or under the Trump administration, someone was going to have to pull the pin on this, and someone is going to have to deal with the flashback that comes from it. Whether the US are more prepared now than they were in the Trump administration, I don't think so. I think there's going to be flashback regardless. But again, it's hard to know whether we end up with a city-state and outer lands, or whether we end up with a six-way civil war, or whether we end up with just everyone kind of sticking to their own regions like they were before the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan back in the 70s. Maybe they kind of just stick to doing their own thing. It's pretty hard to know what's going to happen. Because we don't know who will be the major power players in the power vacuum.
Looking at probably, I was reading an article saying, people talking about India, Pakistan, Iran, Russia, China. Those are all probably going to be, they're probably going to have the most influence, I'd say, after. Do you think there'll be much US influence left over, or will it sort of diminish over time just before we move on?
Cool. The US will continue to put money into it because it does not want this to blow back, even for political reasons. If Biden, if Afghanistan just develops into this horrible ISIS-style, area, that will be the midterms. The midterms will be, Biden ruined Afghanistan. Look, it was fine when Bush walked in. That's what the midterms will become. So no one wants that. They'll chuck money at it to make sure that at least Kabul can stay somewhat settled. Russia is working with the Chinese to keep that, what they call the swirling pit of doom from getting out to Tajikistan. India has always been very, very invested in Afghanistan, mostly because they want Afghanistan to effectively be strong enough to force Pakistan to worry about a two-front war. As well as the stronger an Afghanistan gets, the more you'll start getting the idea of a Pashtunistan, which is the Pashtun areas which is about half or about a third of Pakistan and about a half of Afghanistan. And if there's Pashtun sort of separatism around both those areas, it will weaken Islamabad's position. So India will do anything to make sure that Islamabad's can be weaker. But the big one I think both Pakistan and India would love to see is the idea of the TAPI pipeline. So Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India. This would be able to supply India with an indefinite amount of gas for as long as they could possibly ask for. And Pakistan's up for it. India's up for it. Turkmenistan would love to diversify away from China. But Afghanistan is the trouble because we don't know, who's going to invest that much money to build a pipeline through there while everything's getting blown up. So India would love to see even just a stabilized corridor, even just to build a pipeline. But again, there's too many dice on the table now to know what's going to happen. But yes, India has always been very, very invested in Afghanistan, both for sticking it to Pakistan reasons and also because it would love a stabilized region to access the Central Asia markets and pipelines.